Alrighty guys, let's get right into this. Time for the third, final, and long part of my first Space Marine videos series. Here we'll be splitting it into three parts. First will be a short reaction section, reacting to my first two shorts. The second will be a live critique of my Space Marine, including talking about what I did good, what I didn't do so good, and what I can improve on, in no particular order. And the third will be a miscellaneous section, talking about things like the recordings and in-between clips not featured in the shorts. With that being said, let's get right into it. Alrighty guys, let's go ahead and just get right into the first short. First we're going to just react just here, base, starting screen. Gonna go and turn off the volume. Alright, so the very first thing to note is, here, there was a lot of things that built up to this moment here. I didn't end up including a lot of it. It was briefly showed in the very introduction to this video. But I'll talk about it more once I reach the third section. But I had a 3D printed Terran Space Marine. It's 3D printed in a Mars 2 Pro, and it came out really, really nicely. I believe it's just a standard miniature size, and it came out beautifully. I had cleaned it up, cured it, washed it in soap and water, and had prepared it before getting up to this point. Up to this point, I needed a device to where I could stick the miniature to paint it. So I didn't, rub up against it or anything as I was painting it. So I was just, happened to be in my wood shop at this time because that's where my primer is. And I was just looking around for something cylindrical and something I could just attach to it. I ended up finding this stick on the floor that actually looks really nice. So I ended up getting this stick and I chopped it with a bandsaw and chopped it with a bandsaw, or not the bandsaw, the chop saw I meant, and made it just a nice little hand-sized block. Spray painted it with a clear coat, and then I got this with my little miniature right there. Moving on, then right here, you can see I super glued it, or not super glued, I hot glued on down here. And what I did is because the miniature could potentially melt, I don't know the temperature of how well the resin can hold up against temperature, so just not to risk it, I put the hot glue onto it and I let it cool to where it was almost tacky and putty like, and then I poke the model into it just so it doesn't melt the feet of the model. Moving on from that, we go here where we actually start painting the model. Just again here in my wood shop with the trash can to catch any paint. And then right here is the first major problem I did with this project. Here, I talk about this a little later in the live critique, but this is a spray paint plus primer. So I think that is half the reason why my paint just didn't stick well to the model, is because this is also paint, not just primer. I fixed that and I got some actual primer now. Other than that, it painted on really nicely. I tested the spray paint before spraying it on just so it wouldn't spittle all over my model, and it painted on really nicely. Here, just basic going back and forth with light coats of paint, making sure I get the undersides real nicely, and the top. So you can kind of see right here. It's kind of hard to get like these little cracks in here, and I ended up missing right underneath kind of like the armpits and like underneath the chest plate because it was kind of hard to get the spray paint up in there. So I wasn't exactly able to get it all perfectly, but I got like 99% of it, so it looks really good. And this cool thing about the spray paint is it basically removed all of the print lines. There's no more visible print lines, but it still kept that nice crisp detail. And then here, this is another problem we'll talk about just a little later as well, but framing. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the second and third part of this video, but this is just the framing of this entire series was really poor. Like, this is viewing it, half of it is trash can, another like half of it is just random background, and then only in this little baby corner is where the actual model sits. But then about the actual paint, this is actual white primer, but the white primer, man, I mean, it was who knows how many years old. So the white primer, I didn't test it before spraying it on. That was the big mistake I made. So when I went to just spray it directly onto the model, it ended up spitting out all over my model and leaving all these big white dots all over my model, which wasn't super visible in the end product, but it looks pretty bad. But of course I ended up, let's see here, ended up continuing anyways, right? See, ended up continuing anyways, spraying a little bit more. Then here's my 3D printed base plate. We'll talk about this more in the third part. But here you can see this is a 3D printed base, and I was originally going to go for a kind of like battle, like battle station, like base, metal kind of base, with these were meant to be like plate metals and these were meant to be like kind of conduits. But the 3D printer ended up clogging right near the end of the print, so it ended up not finishing the print. The top layer was still visible and the infill was still visible. So what I ended up doing was I ended up filling this whole thing with hot glue, shaving off the excess, and then sanding it all down to give this kind of neat looking aesthetic. And I ended up switching it over to more of a slate stone-esque kind of aesthetic. It looks a little funny with the conduits, but I think the end product looked alright for relatively low effort. Then you can see kind of back here, it's a little more obvious that it's 3D printed. You can kind of see the print lines here, and it's kind of lightly just sanded. I ended up covering this whole thing in a nice black primer. And then here's my model ready to paint. And then we're going to just talk real fast. This background, again, this is kind of like the framing. The background looks terrible. It's messy. I have my old Xboxes sitting in the background. I have my car oil I haven't changed yet in the background. I mean, it's just kind of a mess in the background. I since changed that, so now we're viewing downwards and the background is no longer full of mess. So we're going to go ahead and move on to part 2 now. Alrighty guys, back at part 2 immediately. We're starting here, painting. This is my kind of cheap, just store-bought box of paint that you can get at the hobby store for $25. This paint painted on okay. Honestly, for it being cheap paint, it wasn't half bad, honestly. It wasn't great paint, but it wasn't half bad either. It was pretty thin out of the pot, but I still ended up having to thin it just a little bit extra, just to get that extra flow. And then I just ended up daubing it on, so it was a nice thick glob of it in the paint. And then it just kind of started throwing it onto the armor panels. Here in the back reference photo, you can see most of the model is just blue. So I ended up just throwing on a base coat of blue. That's what you start with. You always start with a base coat whenever painting miniatures. So you just start with a nice thick sloppy base. So you can see I paint on this thick coat, and then there's the model. Oh, my hand's in the way. That model, you can see the blue is all over the gun, kind of on the feet. It's just kind of thrown on, but this was like 3 or 4 solid just coats of blue to get that nice light blue on there. Next, I got this kind of dark blue wash to fill in all the recesses, and you can kind of see I was filling in all the cracks and crevices, again, just very sloppily. This gives a pretty decent looking aesthetic. Washes are very good for beginners because it gives a decent looking effect very easily. So that's why washes are very popular, especially with beginners, but professionals rarely use washes just because a better looking effect can be manually put on that doesn't look so sloppy. But again, you can get a pretty decent aesthetic for a beginner that's very easy to pull off. My problem with this was I put on too much. I put on too much of this dark wash. So I ended up covering just the whole model in just dark blue. You can kind of see like over here before it was light blue, and then over here it's just dark blue, too dark blue. But then what I did was I got this little gray sponge. I daubed it on right there at this kind of lighter blue, and then I just started kind of lightly tapping it on, giving it kind of like a weathered blue effect. You can kind of see there the nice weathered blue effect. Here, then there's a little bit of brown just onto the leather pouches. Nothing too crazy. Again, need to work on that, but I'll get better with that with time. Here, then we jump to this part. These are not necessarily super in order because here we start with the gray. And the gray, you could see, we started with some light gray paints where all the gray is going to go except the gun, because the gun is going to be just painted a dark gray. I started with a light gray, and then I just built on layers of dark gray to give it a nice kind of shading effect. And here you can see I'm painting the visor. I started with black as an undercoat, and I talk about this a little more in the second part, but I started with a black undercoat. Doesn't look too good with orange. Again, I'll talk about it a little bit more later. Jumping on, just more gray in these under panels. Talk about it more in the second part, won't go over it too much here. And then here, this is again kind of a major framing issue. Like at the center of this image, you have my random DeWalt bag. You have my Xboxes, just random stuff all here in the background, right? And then what you actually are trying to look at is right here, maybe extended to like here. That's all you see down there. So framing issues, I've since resolved that, so hopefully my next videos will look much better. But here, I'm actually just dry brushing on. Basically all I'm doing is I'm just layering on layers of black, then dark gray, lighter gray, lighter gray, lighter gray, and then a very light gray over top. Just lessening how much I put on at each layer. I put on a lot of dark gray, and then a little bit less lighter gray, and then just a very thin dry brushing of light gray to give that kind of slate and depth effect. And then here is my model. I cut off the model. I gently just got a razor blade and pried off the hot glue from the model. Scraped off any glue that was still on the feet of this model, and then I gently hot glued my model back onto this base. And hot glue actually worked with me in this instance because the unevenness of the base caused holes to be underneath the feet of the guy, and it shows just a little bit later here. Let's see here. It's right here where I'm painting on black down here. And this is where the hot glue sat, and the hot glue gave a really nice shadow effect. But here, just painting on some back armor panels. Again, terrible because it's just this tiny little corner. It's slightly better, you're not seeing all the background as much, but again, the model's still hiding down here in the corner. But I'm just painting on little bits of detail, like here, just painting on the armor panels, and then here, painting on those little black shadows on the feet. Here, painting on more and more layers of the visor. Basically, I started with a dark orange across the whole visor, and then I just slowly started adding layers of lighter and lighter and lighter orange to get that nice gradient. And then I just lightly dapped on just a little white dot right there. I actually dabbed on two on purpose. It wasn't actually accidental. I put 2 dots on purpose because I don't know, I thought 2 dots would look kind of neat. Admittedly, it just makes it look like I accidentally put 2 dots. But then here, just adding more detail to like my gun. Admittedly, I went a little too crazy with this. I shouldn't have been doing this here because I had already added the edge highlighting and a dry brush over this. When I did this, it ended up smudging away a lot of detail that I talk about in the second part. Here, just adding more detail to the underplate, and then this was basically when the model was done. In between, I added some other things I talk about in the second part and the third part. But then here in the final step, I basically got a clear, I didn't want to cover the whole thing in a clear coat, a glossy clear coat. I just wanted to cover the visor because the visor is glossy. So I wanted to cover the visor in a nice, glossy, bright, clear coat. I didn't have any just normal clear coat on hand, so I ended up getting a spray can over here, spraying it onto a piece of paper, and then straight from the piece of paper onto the guy's visor with this paintbrush. Ended up destroying this paintbrush. But it is what it is. It's what you do to get a nice effect. And I think it gave a really nice effect overall. Now let's go ahead and move on to the second part where I kind of just critique my model a little bit more. See you guys there.
Alrighty guys, let's get right into this. So, judging this little space marine, so far, just as a very first model, I think I did alright. But just alright. There's definitely some things I could have done better, and definitely some things I hopefully will definitely be able to improve on in the future. So let's see here. A couple things just right off the bat to start with. The paint I used is not the highest quality. So, the model has some kind of almost fluffy looking texturing on it. It's kind of hard. You can't really see it in the camera, but it's got some light texturing to it that causes it to look almost fuzzy. And because the paint is of a pretty low quality, just rubbing this blade against the model, it'll scratch the paint right off. Even just rubbing my finger on it will scratch the paint right off, so that's why I'm holding it by the base. Next, probably one of the biggest things I definitely want to work on is right here in the visor. This hopefully will be improved with higher quality paint, which I did recently get. So hopefully my next paints will be of a higher quality. So obviously that's not, obviously poor quality paint isn't an excuse for everything. Here I could have still done better where I didn't thin out my paints well enough while putting on this visor, and I should have started with a white base coat. I kept it as the black base coat underneath, and I just started layering on layers of orange and lighter orange, and then with the little white dot. So I had to put like 10 layers of orange onto this, and I didn't really thin it hardly at all, so it has a kind of clumpy finish to it. And again, you can't really see it much in the camera, but it's got kind of a clumpy finish to it. But I think overall it looks pretty decent. I think I got a pretty nice gradient going on. The dot's nice, and the glossy coat gives it kind of a nice little shimmer as well, and I think that's kind of a nice little add-on because I have that kind of glimmer already, but you know, the silver, the slight glimmer of it gives it a little bit of an extra aesthetic instead of it just being like flat orange. So base coat with white and then thin my paints on and just add careful layers to give a nice orange gradient. Next, over here, the leather pouch. Definitely need to get better with painting leather. This leather pouch is pretty lackluster in almost every way. It's meh at best. I'll be practicing more leather here real soon. One of my next projects has a lot of miniatures with leather on them. So I'll get some real good practice painting things like clothing and leather. Let's see here. Next, the base, I was going to go for something different. This was not a mistake necessarily with painting, but with 3D design and then running this on my 3D printer. My printer ended up breaking like halfway through the print, so it only ended up finishing part way. And I included that earlier in the video, where it only ended up finishing it partly. So what I ended up doing was I didn't end up recording any of this because the video was just bad, but I ended up filling in all the little holes in the top with hot glue. It gave this kind of neat stone-like texture, so I ended up going with that, but now you have these kind of weird just holes inside of this, and it's just, they feel a little out of place. I was originally going to go with kind of like a metal, like these were going to look like metal plates, and these were going to be like just cracks in between them, but ended up not really going with that aesthetic, and I ended up going with kind of like a nice stone. And if it didn't have these little conduits, this would probably look really great. Just a nice basic stone aesthetic. Next, let's see here. Some of these edge highlights I did in the armor plates, like back here, are way too thick. The gray throughout here is just way too thick, and like right here, too thick there. But it was pretty good like right here where it's just nice thin orange lines, in fact, or gray lines. But I probably could have done a little better, like you can hardly see it right there. So definitely could work a little better on these kind of nice edge highlights, because you know, some of them are just too thick, some of them are too thin. Getting some more consistency with those will definitely improve the model. Let's see here. Some things like down here, like just the gray gradient down here just doesn't look that good. It looks kind of all over the place. It doesn't look bad, but it just kind of looks all over the place. So that could definitely be improved. Let's see here. I ended up trying to, and this wasn't really shown in the video, but I tried to put a metal burn on this nozzle and on the gun tip. They're slightly darker than, the gun tip is slightly darker than the rest of the gun, and these are slightly darker than the rest of the gray. And it's because I tried to give a gun burn, the metal burn aesthetic, but it ended up just not really working. It looks just meh, like it looks like a slightly purple gray. So could definitely work on that. Granted, this is kind of hard, especially like right here with such a tiny little surface, but could definitely work on that as well. Let's see here. I think those are probably the biggest things that I could definitely work on. Now, things I think I did all right. The slate on the bottom, I think looks really good. Again, if it didn't have that conduit, I think this just base slate looks really good as just a basic platform. It's not too intricate or fancy, and it probably isn't going to get too many looks, but it looks decent. Like it doesn't look just bland and flat and boring. It looks decent. I think I did really good just generally on the gun with the edge highlighting and slight weathering. Could have done a little better, like it looks a little bland right there and right there. And I could have filled this in a little better with black and these little holes with black. But overall, I think the edge highlighting and everything looks pretty decent on this. Let's see here. Generally, I think just getting a nice coat on and everything looks all right. Like overall, I think the model looks just decent. I think I did really good with these Under Armour panels as well, where I painted them all a dark gray, and then I put on some nice lighter gray over the top of it, and then I filled it with a slightly black wash gently, and then I kind of just tapped it along there, so you get these really nice black recesses, and then the light gray tops. Overall, I think that looks really solid. Other than the clumpiness on the visor, I think the visor looks really good as just a first attempt. The gradient on it looks pretty solid. The only problem, this is just a problem with the model. Painting, if you look down from the top of it, if you look down from the top of it, it might be kind of hard to see, but there's like these little crevices right here inside the visor. It's almost impossible to paint inside those crevices. So it was hard for me to really kind of clean up inside this. So there's a little bit of residue, blue and orange in there that looks just kind of messy, but I can't do anything about it because it's too deep in there to get a paintbrush down in there. Let's see here. So I think those are the things I did pretty all right with. And then the absolute biggest thing I messed up. This was easily the biggest thing I messed up. I really messed up the base coat. The base primer coat I messed up. And I didn't show this in the video, but what I did wrong was I painted the entire model with a primer plus spray paint. So that causes it to just be really, this can be easily scratched off. It might be because of the paint as well, but this can be easily scratched off as a result. Good thing this is just meant to be a display model. It's not meant to be a play model. So as long as it's not touched and it's held by the base like I'm doing right now, it should be all right. And then this was shown in the video, but the white primer, I did actually have white primer. The white primer I put over the top of this model was old bad primer. And I didn't test it before spraying it onto the model. The black one I did test before spraying on the model, and it sprayed nicely and evenly, so I didn't think too much of it, so I used it. I got some actual black primer, so that shouldn't be a problem next time. But on this, I also got some good white primer, some fresh brand new white primer. And the old primer was just, it sputtered out and it caused a whole bunch of little dots over the top of this. And you can't really see it. You can see small ones, like there's a big dot right there and right there. But overall, it wasn't too bad, but I would have liked to put on a nicer white coat on the top of it. And the reason why is because putting on a nice white coat, that does like half the work for you when it comes to shading, because the color on top will be a lighter color than the stuff down here. So it'll give kind of a natural light effect to it. So that'll definitely be something I'll improve on in the future. But overall, those are probably the biggest things to be talking about with this little guy. Next up, I'm not going to spoil it yet, but we got some pretty cool little miniatures to be painting here real soon, and some other similar models. So stay tuned with that.
Alrighty guys, this last section is going to be a quick one. First we're going to get right into some of the things that covered or were missed. To get started, this right here is the clean model after printing, curing, and cleaning. None of this step was shown, as well as the 3D print part and some of the painting. There's a couple reasons for this. The first is needing to fit it into a video, obviously, and then the second was because a lot of the process was just so chaotic with this model, as it being my first time, that I was just not able to record some of it. This also segues into the second thing I want to talk about, the actual video. The biggest problem was framing was a consistent issue throughout this project. Here are a few examples of just how bad the framing got at times. This often caused me to scrap over half the recordings that I had made. This is definitely an area I'll improve on in the future, but regarding that, before this video gets much longer, let's finish up here. I hope you all enjoyed. There will be more to come soon. Bye-bye.